Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to get started. Looks like some people are still joining us, but we're going to go ahead and move forward. Just some housekeeping issues. Just as a reminder, we ask that you keep your video off unless you are speaking. We will have some time for question and answer at the end, and we may open that up for verbal questions. So that would be a time for you to use your video. But unless you were speaking, we ask that you just keep your videos off. All of the microphones will be muted throughout today's presentation. So there will be a time for questions at the end, and those will be moderated through the chat panel. So I ask that if you do have questions throughout the presentation, you can chat those in. In the bottom of your screen, there is a chat button, and you can type in any questions, and our presenter will be able to answer those towards the end. Also, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our YouTube page, and we will link any resources that George mentioned. So don't feel like you have to take notes or anything. We will link all of that for you. And you also have the opportunity to receive a PDH certificate for attending today's webinar. So I just ask that if you did not register through Eventbrite, that you send an email to pianc@usace.army.mil, and we will go over that again at the end to make sure that you receive your certificate. Also, if you can hear me right now and the audio may sound muffled or anything like that, I encourage you to connect your audio from your phone. You can change your audio settings in the bottom of your screen. And you can have the webinar call you, or you can dial in. That is the best way to get a connection rather than connecting from your computer. So with that, I will turn it over to Jim Walker. He is one of our PIANC USA commissioners, and he is going to tell you a little bit more about PIANC.
All right, thank you, Kayla, and welcome everyone. It's an honor to get to talk to you this morning. You see here the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure. That's the title we're given for PIANC, and that's the name we're going by. PIANC is the global organization for providing guidance on the sustainable water transport infrastructure. You'll see the picture there of various publications. These are international experts that develop these industry guidelines. They're used as a standard practice or best practice in your efforts. PIANC is organized under some technical and scientific commissions. You see them abbreviated here on this list. INCOM, that's inland navigation topics. MarCom is the maritime navigation. RecCom is recreational navigation. And INVICOM addresses environmental matters. So in addition to our technical commissions, we have non-technical commissions for the cooperation for international cooperation and relations with countries in transitions. We have a promotional commission, a young professionals commission, and an executive commission. So in the way that, again, PIANC is set up, you have levels of, you have corporate members, we have individual members, and then you have on the national level, the qualifying members, countries that are in the process of becoming a full national section. Highlighted in green are the ones that are the qualifying members, and then in the yellow color is the national sections. When you get to the green level, that gives you the opportunity to do country associations activities under that PIANC name. And so this is our membership worldwide. So now I'll turn it over to Ron Heffron. Ron is the principal U.S. representative to the Maritime Navigation Commission for today's presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I'm with COE. I'm serving, as Jim mentioned, with the as the U.S. rep to MarCom, and have the delight today to introduce you to our speaker, George Detweiler. George has been the U.S. representative to Working Group 161 and has tremendous background in this field. He's retired from the Coast Guard after 20 years of service and then went to work for the Coast Guard. He's Civilian Marine Transportation Specialist and the Marine Transportation Systems Director at Coast Guard Headquarters. So he returned from uniform service to civilian service. He is a member of the U.S. delegation to the IMO's Subcommittee on Navigation, Communication, and Search and Rescue. His major projects have included conducting right whale and Atlantic coast port access route studies, creating ship routing measures, including Russian Federation U.S. joint proposal on routing measures in the Bering Sea and Strait, conducting tribal consultations, reviewing offshore wind energy installations, proposals. So he works closely with the Coast Guard's National Navigation Safety Advisory Council on safety of navigation issues, including co-rigs and the inland navigation rules and the development of best practices for unmanned maritime systems. He's also been a panelist at many alternative energy and UMS workshops. So with that, George, the floor is all yours. And we'll come back at the end. If you have questions along the way, please use the chat box for that, and we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, let me share my screen. Thank you, Ron, for that great introduction. I really appreciate it. Hopefully everybody can hear me. My PowerPoint is up on the screen, and hopefully everybody's seeing that. I was asked to talk about MarCom 161, but as part of that, I was also asked to do a small presentation on offshore wind in the United States, especially because the MarCom 161 talked an awful lot about wind farms. So again, my objectives today are to provide an overview of offshore wind. I'll explain a little bit of the Coast Guard's roles and responsibilities, objectives of what we're trying to do, the use of an evaluation of nav safety risk assessments, and touch on marine spatial planning guidelines, or known as MSP, and then I'll provide an overview of the actual working group report and explain its various facets. All right, why can't I get to my next slide? Oh. All right, there we go. The next slide up shows an overview of offshore wind in the United States. At present, we actually have two very, very small wind farms that are operational. One is off of Block Island, which has 5 turbines to it, and one is known as the CVAL, or Commonwealth of Virginia Offshore Wind Test Project, which has 2 turbines that are actually generating electricity as we speak. I would be remiss if I didn't, note that BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is the actual lead agency in the United States for offshore wind. They lease the Outer Continental Shelf and go through a very rigorous process, and the Coast Guard is one of many cooperating agencies that works with BOEM. Anyway, BOEM has issued 16 leases, for the moment, all on the East Coast. And I indicate there, there's a couple leases off of Delaware, Virginia, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, Massachusetts itself, New York, and North Carolina. In addition, BOEM is looking at wind energy areas, or call areas, in the following areas. One is the New York Bight, and they've got 4 different areas that they're looking at for potential leases. There's 6 off of North and South Carolina. There's 3 off of California, and 2 off of Hawaii that are being studied and looked at by BOEM. And in the future, we anticipate that there will be requests and leases off the coast of the Gulf of, or in the Gulf of Maine, in the Gulf of Mexico, predominantly off of Louisiana, and in the Great Lakes, predominantly off of Cleveland. Our Coast Guard roles and responsibilities are quite simple. We need to ensure our nation's maritime safety, security, and stewardship. We are recognized as subject matter expert for those items listed on the screen. We are a member of BOEM State Energy Task Forces. Everyone, the Coast Guard will be represented there. Again, as I indicated earlier, we collaborate on the use of nav safety risk assessments for evaluating specific projects, and we are also a cooperating agency to BOEM for NEPA purposes. Our objectives are, I like to believe, are quite simple. We want to protect all mariners' property, which includes the wind farms and the environment. Again, we will provide recommendations and identify potential impacts to BOEM for their NEPA purposes. We want to ensure safe navigation for the entire maritime community, try to preserve the traditional uses of the particular waterway, for the, especially for the marine transportation system and for fishing. We have to make sure that we still have the ability to carry out our other missions, search and rescue, marine environmental protection, and law enforcement. Our mantra can be said, to the extent practical, reconcile the need for access routes and, again, everybody else's uses of the water. We want to maintain a safe and secure and efficient marine transportation system. We need to make sure that goods can flow to and from U.S. ports. And we also want to help make sure that our DOD can do their job in national defense and commercial vessel traffic. Navigation safety risk assessment. We ask that BOEM require of any developer of a wind farm to develop a nav safety risk assessment for presentation to both BOEM and us. And we review it. We want to make sure. We know that where there once was nothing, there is now something in the water that, if we let Murphy take its course, things are going to get run over, and we don't want that. We want to make sure that, again, ships can travel near wind farms. Wind farms can occupy a certain area. In other words, coexist. That's what we want to be able to do. I define an NSRA. It's an assessment of the nav risks, leveraging existing studies and standard industry practices. Again, this is done by the developer and presented to the Coast Guard. They're also supposed to identify potential mitigation measures. We do provide them guidance in the form of a NAVIC 0119, which also includes our marine planning guidelines. And at the end of the day, when we're all done our reviews, we provide BOEM recommendations and conditions that they can make sure that the developer handles. We have marine spatial guidelines in the United States. We developed them as part of our port access route study along the Atlantic coast. At the time, there was not a lot going on, but we did get input from CESMA, the World Shipping Council, the UK's Maritime Coast Guard Agency, who's very much in the forefront of monitoring wind farms, and also from the German Waterways and Shipping Directorates. Major topics in our marine planning guidelines are port approaches and traffic separation schemes, shore routes, deep draft routes. We identify contributions to risk, and then we propose and identify some possible mitigations that a developer can consider. And I think that'll wrap up for the wind portion, because the main portion of this is to discuss this, the MarCom work group report. I tried to figure out what would be the best way to do this. There's an awful lot of information jam-packed in a 75-page or so report. I think all I'm going to do is just kind of go give you highlights out of the various chapters, and can go down, like I said, go down the report. Chapter 1, the general aspects, it provides a scope. An idea is, what the group was going to try to do. They were try to develop an approach to assess maneuvering space and identify minimum recommended distances between shipping lanes and the wind farms, noting that hopefully what they came up with can be applicable to any type of offshore renewable energy installation, not just necessarily wind farms. And they came up with some ideas about how to develop guides for marine spatial planning. Within Chapter 1 also, they identified their terms of reference. They provided for an historical background. Again, I'd say simple in terms is that wind farms are occupying space that ships once did, and therefore traffic is going to have to move or successfully be able to go through, and there will be certain size limitations that they won't be able to do that. And then the objective and product of the study was to develop guidelines and recommendations and a list of situations and criteria to consider. In addition, they looked at methodology, reviewed current practices, tried to identify different situations, and then understand that there's new tools that have come along and make sure that they're incorporated into any kind of study or evaluation of wind farms, especially in the area of risk assessment and simulations. Chapter 1 also just gives you a breakdown of the structure of the report, identifies related PIANC reports, who the members were of the group, acknowledges the various meetings they had, which made me kind of jealous because most of them were over in Europe. So I could only attend one or two of those, and it acknowledged other folks in their involvement in the development of the report. Marine spatial planning was the next chapter. Basically, they wanted to identify interactions. Marine spatial planning for this group was defined by UNESCO. It's also marine spatial planning as an element of sea use management. It also involves environmental, to make sure that it started that way off of the Great Barrier Reef, is that the Australians looked at, the management approach of that particular waterway and how they could protect it. And, of course, there's also an economic portion to marine spatial planning as well. This gives you an idea. I think UNESCO identified this as kind of a process where you start out with a marine spatial plan and how you would go through and implement it, monitoring it, evaluate it, and then possibly go back through it again to make sure you got it right the first time. And it's just an iterative process. It is the responsibility of each maritime state to kind of come up with marine spatial planning guidelines. The idea is extended over the EEZ. It is ecosystem-based. It's wanted to take a holistic view of all the human activities in the area, again, from recreational to fishing to, in some cases, believe it or not, surfing. So these are the type of things you should look at. And again, like I said earlier, it is an adaptive and iterative process. To identify, and here's some other areas or additional considerations or uses of the water, and I won't list them all, but it ranges everything from military training areas to scientific research to tourism. And renewable energy was identified, of course. That's the lead on this. Second part of marine spatial planning is known as maritime emergency planning. And the report discusses the various contingencies and the process by which you would start. Again, by planning, what are you going to do and how you're going to prevent emergencies. Do you have a level of preparedness to handle them, responses and recovery, and again, you start all over again. Types of emergencies can be broken down into basically 4 areas: people, planet, or again, the environment, property, that's vessels, wind farms, anything else that's in the water, and a profession accent. In other words, an emergency could, in fact, hurt a company, if they're not capable of managing their vessels, or again, the wind farm operators and developers, they don't want their profession to be hurt if they do things wrong. So, again, another way of looking at that. Chapter 3 was pretty much simply entitled Legal Background. In it, they identified the major conventions and the organizations and their particular regulations and guidelines to be considered during marine spatial planning, and I've listed them here. UNCLOS, UNESCO, as I mentioned earlier, International Maritime Organization, especially their general provisions on ships routing, the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, or COLREGs, as people know it, the ITU, to make sure that communications are maintained and not hurt by the development of wind farms, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, understanding that they will have impact on aircraft and helicopters operating in the area. So these are things to look at and to make sure you take into consideration when a marine spatial plan is being developed. Some of the navigation, Chapter 4 talks about navigation constraints, collision avoidance, and marine navigation marking. This is a very large chapter and had an awful lot of information in it. And again, it discussed some of the most important factors that must be considered. Obviously, the type of ships, type of cargoes, again, marine traffic in general, hydrographic conditions, any aids to navigation, hydrodynamics, and if there's a necessity for pilotage, escorting, or towing requirements have to be looked at as well. And then marking and lighting of wind farms, and I cite the IALA recommendation on 139. And so did the study. This is very, very important that not only do they discuss aids to navigation in the area, but how the wind farms will be marked and lighted to help protect mariners. Again, the analysis that are looked at, you start out conceptually. There may not be an actual design of a wind farm, but maybe just a preliminary. And you start doing estimates of safety distances and to look at where we think the traffic is and how close you can get to a potential farm. And then the next phase would be a detailed analysis, basically a simulation if it's possible, and the tools are available to do that. A marine traffic analysis, I mean, that's really looking at the types, frequency, where they travel, again, the cargoes they carry. Do a risk analysis, which is a little bit different than a numerical analysis, but again, look at the risks of having wind farms in the water, and if necessary, do a cost-benefit analysis. Are these wind farms where they may be located, are they going to drive the cost of shipping up, or could it drive the cost of shipping down? Again, something to look at. We identify the risk assessment in Chapter 4. It is the first step in development, in the development and an application of a marine environmental protection, or I'm sorry, marine emergency plan. You gather data, you identify a hazard. Again, you do the risk analysis. You do an assessment of existing mitigation measures, and you identify any other ones. And then once all this is done, you can have once the risk assessment has been completed with identified risk control measures selected or identified, the MEP can be established. The work group felt that it needed to mention electronic magnetic radiations, and I will be very candid, this is not my area of expertise, but nonetheless it is something that developers of wind farms and mariners need to be aware of. Basically, you have a spinning blade, which is going to create some form of electronic magnetic radiations, and as can be seen on the picture, and therefore it could affect the interaction between the offshore wind farm and vessels. They could also affect national defense radars, weather radars, and most especially maritime navigation equipment, which could include shipboard radar, vessel traffic service radars, communication, AIS, the global navigation satellite system, for example. I would stress here that they are mitigatable and they are able to be handled. We have vessels going past wind, when I say we, the maritime community of the world has vessels going past wind farms every day, predominantly in Europe, of course, because we don't have them yet in the United States, and they're successful. The report of any form of accidents or anything is virtually non-existent. Next, Chapter 6 talks about emergency procedures. Again, part of part of planning for these projects, you have to worry about emergency response, again, to protect people with search and rescue. How do you do pollution oil spill contingencies? Heaven forbid, should a vessel happen to hit a wind farm and spill its cargo and or its bunker fuels. If that happens, then you now have property and assets, and you have the possibility of salvage. Again, SAR planning, pollution response, salvage plans, and cabling redundancy in order to keep the wind farm operating are very, very important aspects. Chapter 7, that we provide a summary of the recommendations, again, about preparing a marine spatial plan and a marine environmental protection plan, proposing routing measures to IMO can be very, very important. As I mentioned earlier, mariners themselves need to be reminded of navigation with caution and possibly avoid wind farms or go around them. Consider the electronic magnetic issues and its impacts. Develop the response plans, marking and lighting of the farm, all with the goal of reducing risk to as low as reasonably practical, if at all possible. I list this because, in addition to all that was presented in the body of the report, the appendices can be very, very important. Again, it outlines a whole bunch of references that were used. A glossary is provided so that everybody can start speaking the same language, so to speak. Again, the terms of reference for the particular report were defined again and separated here just for ease of reviewing. And then there was 5 appendices that discuss current practices in the various countries that are listed: the Netherlands, Japan, France, Sweden, and Germany. Basically, how are they doing it, and where were they at the time of the report, and what are they looking at, what they've taken into consideration. And I think that's about it for my presentation. I thank you for the opportunity. I thank PIANC for the opportunity of allowing me to be on that work group. Some of our things in the United States were done pre-report because we're starting to step out in front of wind, but this report can be used. I will state, and I don't say this negatively, but when you read it, just understand that it does have a slight European bent to it. Again, most of the members of that group were from Europe, and in some respects, we're much further ahead of the United States at the time of the report in the area of wind development and shipboard interaction with those wind farms. So again, I thank PIANC for the opportunity to do this.
Thank you, George. I think it's a really good overview of the content. Obviously, in a webinar like this, you can't get into a lot of how-to and detail. But if anybody has questions, I see one from Tricia. How do we get a copy of this report? Can we download it? Maybe, Kayla, will this be sent out to folks with guidance on how they can get access to the report?
Yes, so to have access to the report, you need to be a member of PIANC USA or part of a corporate membership. So if you're a member of PIANC USA, then yes, you can go to pianc.org and you can have access to any of those reports as part of your membership fee. So that's really the only way to access these reports is to be a member.
Nick has asked a question: are there any unique barriers for wind farms on the Great Lakes? I've heard about the proposed Cleveland site, but have not heard of anything on Lake Michigan. Is there a navigational concern or consideration to be aware of unique to Lake Michigan?
In simplest of terms, there's always a concern. The Great Lakes, obviously, those projects are being, state-run. But again, the Coast Guard will look at it, and yes, we always have to be concerned as to placement of them. There are traditional routes, if I can use that term in quotes, on the Great Lakes that go from certain city pairs that the tankers use up there and the other type of vessels. under the Lake Carriers Association. So again, we wouldn't want to encroach on those. And again, at the end of the day is we would want to make sure that any lake farm, if you will, would be basically constructed the same way, with the same coloring schemes, marking schemes, lighting schemes, location on charts, those type of information. So yeah, we definitely want to make sure that any type of mariner is protected out there. If should a wind farm go in any of the Great Lakes. I will say that I think the process for the lakes has been kind of slow moving at this point. I don't know that it's got as much interest as it does on the at the more federal level for along the coast.
Yeah, I think Lake Erie has probably a little bit more action than other Great Lakes. But Wojciech, sorry if I mispronounced your name, has a question about what is your opinion about the practicality to prevent drifting collision of a large ship during a storm?
Well, it's always a possibility, and hopefully by either formal routing measures or that the mariner himself using prudence that that they will stay proper distance away should they happen to have an emergency. Yeah, can it happen? I'm not so sure if there's possibility statistics. I think a lot of that will be based on, size of the vessel, also the spacing of the farm. Some of these are going to end up being, the towers themselves or the wind turbine generators can be upwards of a mile apart, which sort of leaves a gap, if you will. It's always a possibility. We're not going to get down to zero risk.
Here's a follow-up question, George. I'll just ask, would you send people to the forecastle, to anchors, blackout, engine, any emergency procedures like that, I think is what he's trying to get to.
I didn't quite get the beginning of the question, Ron.
It's a follow-up on the practicality of drifting during a storm. And would you have personnel take emergency actions like stationing them on manning anchors, a blackout, I think the question is dealing with engine blackouts and that sort of thing.
Again, I would think that any type of shipping organization and or companies would have their proper procedures on how to handle those type of emergencies should they lose power or electric, or should they lose a rudder type thing. So whatever they do to prepare for that, that's normal voyage planning. I don't know that there's much else we can do other than, and also a lot of the ships have redundancy on certain equipment, so that helps keep that risk even in general down. So could it happen? Yes. Developers are supposed to, I think, analyze the potential of that and provide information to us to look at in their nav safety risk assessment.
Mark Jaworski has a question: who is ultimately responsible for approving the offshore wind navigation plans for the Northeast Atlantic, Maine through North Carolina?
I think I understand the question. The Coast Guard is responsible to develop, which we are in the process of developing fairways along the Atlantic coast for a couple reasons. One is to sort of denote where the traffic tends to go normally anyway, so that BOEM doesn't lease those particular areas to construct wind farms. I will say it's a lot of back and forth discussions with BOEM to ensure that can be done. We are the responsible agency to create fairways, traffic separation schemes, and use of other routing measures. So we're looking at that. If need be, we create regs and or proposals that have to go to IMO. For example, traffic separation schemes have to go to IMO. Also, they go in regulations as well, but before going into regulations, we'd want to get them approved at the IMO level. Hopefully that answered this question.
Okay. Manny has a question on other design guidelines for offshore wind farms. I can probably answer that one for you, is not through PIANC. There are specific issues like this navigation consideration that PIANC has addressed. To my knowledge, PIANC doesn't have any other guidelines relating to offshore wind farms, but certain jurisdictions have their own design guidelines, and the U.S. is no exception. I think OWIA has design standards, and the certified verification agents, the CVAs, have guidelines that they follow in approving these. Another question, the main risk from shipping to the wind farms are collisions. Either we go far away from the wind farm, or is it a bit fictitious exercise? I'm not sure if we need to, and follow up to that. The risks between traffic are, of course, interactions between traffic streams, and wind farm has an effect on this. So this PIANC guideline may be useful. So thank you, Wojciech, for that commentary. Let me ask a different question, if I might. George, when you were writing this document with this group, did you come across any contentious issues that had to be dealt with? And I'm curious if there were any controversies, because sometimes we encounter those in these report development projects.
To be candid, no, I didn't. I would say one of the issues that's contentious, not necessarily with this group, but with wind farms in general, is there are marine planning guidelines. And for example, in the report, they talk about a 2-mile radius turn or a 2+ radius turn, depending on the size of the vessel, the speed of the vessel, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And some of the recommendations were, let's say, stay 2 miles away. That said, I know in the United States as well as the UK, we actually have some farms that'll probably be a little closer than 2 miles to like the edge of a traffic separation scheme, understanding that most of the traffic tends to stay center line anyway. So they're going to have that sort of a composite distance that should work. I am aware of some farms in Europe that they're only like a mile away, and yet ships are doing fine. The other issue that may be a little contentious out in the world is going through wind farms. And again, we have to leave that up to the masters in some regards to say, look, this is just not prudent for me to even go through there, even though it's a little shorter to get from point A to point B. I'll have to go around. But on the same token, we're not restricting anybody from going in either, because we see vast opportunities for things like recreational fishing, even regular fishing. The old adage to us is, if you build it, they will come, i.e. put sticks in the water, fish are going to come. So those are some issues that we constantly have to talk to people about and remind them that, yeah, you ought to be able to go in there, but that at the end of the day, it's your call.
Mm-hmm. There's another question from Wojciech about what is your opinion about recreation traffic being pushed into traffic lanes because of the closing of the wind farms to these small vessels like in Germany and Belgium?
Well, again, we've not taken that tag in the United States. I'm not so sure. You're right. If there's smaller, slower traffic that has to go around, you're right. They're going to mix, and that's an issue that has to be discussed a little bit about the mixing of traffic. I didn't realize Germany restricted folks from going through, or at least of wreck boaters. If anything, I think I'd do the other way myself. If the wreck boat's going to run along the same coastline and can zip through a wind farm without hurting itself, it stays out of the way of the big boys because they don't want them around them either, themselves either, because they're going 20, 30 knots and they don't want to mix. So yeah, that's an issue that has to be looked at. Possible mixing of traffic. We may have that, and we're probably going to have some of that issue along the Atlantic coast of the United States because we not only have the large freighters and, cargo vessels that are capable, 20 and 30 knots and plus, but we have tugs and barges, which tend to creep along a little bit. Now, right now, they themselves tend to separate themselves. They don't want to tangle with each other, so to speak, so they sort of identify. And our AIS documentation shows that certain types of vessels go in one area and tugs and barges go in another. So,
do the rules change based on mid-ocean conditions, like foggy days and that sort of thing? There are more safety precautions typically put into place.
Again, we won't put seasonal requirements on it or weather requirements on it. Again, it's up to the mariner. One of the things we're doing is, for example, there's a very large area off of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and while the guidance out of IALA is you don't necessarily have to light every wind turbine generator, we in fact are going to tell BOEM that we require it because of that. We know the south of the Martha's Vineyard in New England is quite foggy, quite a few times of the year, and so it's just another aid that hopefully we can provide to the mariner that wants to scoop through a wind farm, that they'll see every tower, that they won't hit something they can't see.
George, we have a lot of developers in the USA who are bringing their European experience to the U.S. Are there any significant differences between the requirements for navigation in the U.S. versus the European experience?
As far as navigation, no. I mean, all our wind farms are going to be right now far enough out that coal regs will apply. Well, that should apply, I would assume, over the European farms as well. One issue that's slowly being, discussed at the moment is I'm well aware that the European developers are allowed the request of the appropriate administration to have navigation safety zones put around the vessel and that's constructing a wind turbine generator, for example. And then up until probably the beginning of the year, the Coast Guard did not have the authority to go out past 12 nautical miles. I mean, in other words, we're allowed to create safety zones, but only out to 12 nautical miles. We believe that has changed with the National Defense Off Act. I will say at this point that our lawyers are reviewing all of that, quite succinctly to make sure that, okay, what did Congress really give us? But it appears that they've basically extended our authority out, especially for safety zones, out to the end of the EEZ, which hopefully, and I sense from the NAV safety risk assessments from some of the companies that have put those in, that's a very important point to them, that they feel comfortable that there is a safety zone around them, that people are told to stay away and don't get too close because of the work that it's being done to construct these things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And there are a couple other additional questions relating to a similar theme on security. Security against sabotage, or Jane Rowan is asking, would you be able to comment on the responsibility for security of the wind farms?
Not my area of expertise per se, but we are aware and we've raised it. In the Coast Guard we work obviously for DHS, who's very concerned with security. I think people are, when I say people, I think certain organizations in the government are recognizing that as these things are constructed and they're becoming part of the infrastructure, they're going to become part of critical infrastructure. And so those issues are being discussed, is the best I can say at the moment. The Coast Guard out to 12 has the authority to create security zones. I'm not so sure that'll go all the way out to 200. The hard part about both of those, safety and security zones, is the capability to enforce them. Some of it may be self-enforcing. Some of it may be where the wind farm itself, I know they have op centers that watch their farms. We might have to come up with a scheme where they can report a possible infraction to us and however we would handle it. So Yeah, I think agencies that concern themselves with critical infrastructure, especially as we're trying to get more and more green energy, and the use of offshore wind is becoming more and more prolific. The government's going to have to, the U.S. is going to have to look at critical infrastructure and how to protect it.
So Wojciech has another interesting question of how do you treat the safety of the cabling within the wind farm as well as the export cables? It's not so much a navigation question, although I am interested if you have insights on this, George. But when I mentioned earlier that there are no guidelines within PIANC on the design of wind farms, I should also clarify that there is a working group called Working Group 187 that's working on a document regarding the protection of undersea pipelines and cables in navigable areas. So while it's not specifically focused on offshore wind, it does have direct applicability, and this is a really important issue. It's also important for LNG terminals and the like that involve subsea pipelines. Anyway, George, do you have comment on this?
Again, I think when BOEM, the contractors, as part of their plans, have to submit where they're going to run their cable. I think there are standards on how deep the cable has to be buried, or if it can't be buried due to the type of bottom, then a company may be required to put something above it, such as blankets, what they call blankets, concrete barriers. I believe as a one level of protection, and probably doesn't sound like much, is that obviously they're supposed to be charted, so mariners know that that there's cables below them, so don't be drilling or don't be excavating or in fact try not to anchor unless it's an absolute emergency. Again, if they're buried deep, the cables are buried deep enough, for the most part they're protected, but the other area would be too is dragging fishermen. Mm-hmm. They need to know where the cables are so that they don't drag over them. I don't know how long 6 feet would stay 6 feet above a cable if there's an awful lot of dragging above it. So again, a concern. I believe part of the plans not only are to mark where the towers are, but where the cables run. I know there's been discussion with some of the developers to run them parallel. In other words, keep the cables running down their farm from tower to tower to tower to tower until maybe the end, where they can have them converge to their energy platform for distribution. So those thoughts have been discussed as well.
Okay. Tricia is also asking a question about recreational fishing. What do you do when these wind farms attract recreational fishermen because they're creating great habitat? Have you run into these issues?
Other than the fact that, as I said earlier, we're not going to restrict them. We don't see any need to, unless all of a sudden we determine that doing that is unsafe to the mariner. We expect it. In fact, very early on, for those that are familiar with the Cape Wind project, which obviously never got built, one of the issues was there was all of a sudden a secondary industry that was being considered by some of the local fishermen and or the ferry companies that that they were going to take people out. Sort of like what we refer to as a headboat, is to take them out and say, guess what? For $50, we'll give you a box lunch and we'll give you a tour of the wind farm. And great. We're not going to stop them from doing that. The one thing we don't want them to do is hook onto a tower. They're not really allowed to do that. I guess you could say technically it's private property, unless it's an emergency. If you have to get on or tie yourself off or get up on their platform, do so for an emergency. But no, we're again, that's why we've stipulated from the beginning. Up until now, we're not restricting unless we learn otherwise. We're not restricting access to wind farm, especially for the recreational boaters. That's a question we have been asked in the past, and we're trying to stay consistent with that message. Is that, hey, hopefully you're going to be able to go in there and catch lots of fish. And we hope you have a good time.
I think that brings us to the end of the questions, unless anybody else wants to chime in quickly. I guess that then reverts back to Joe, right? Thank you, George. I really appreciate the presentation and addressing all these questions. Good dialogue.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Joe?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. My name is Joe Menas. I'm the secretary for the PIANC USA section. And I want to thank George Detweiler and Ron Hepron for organizing and putting this together. It's a good presentation. Lots of things for me that I wasn't aware of. So these discussions, I think, are healthy and productive. PIANC USA looks forward to having one of these at least every quarter. And we're actually looking to have them a bit more often than that. I think the price is right. No charge. So I encourage you to participate. And if you have suggestions on things to be included, please let us know. Our initial efforts are to work with the working group reports that are published and share those, use this as a forum. But in addition to doing that 4 times a year, there could be other topics of special interest that you would like for us to make available. So please, you'll see the emails in a minute and send us a note. So PIANC USA, or PIANC in general, we encourage you to become a member. Many of you are members through your work, whether that's a government agency or private industry. However you join, we encourage you to do so. And thank you for your time. There's a lot of benefits to being PIANC, access to all the working group reports and other technical reports that come out. Those are available free to charge. There's a fairly substantial charge if you're not a member. So I think that alone probably justifies the investment. So if you're interested in becoming a member, just send an email to the address that you see on the screen, and you'll connect with either me or Kayla Waltemeyer, who's running the webinar today. There's also information on the PIANC USA website. Just Google it, it'll pop up. Next slide, please.
Joe, I have one final request or comment. As the U.S. rep to MarCom, we're always interested in new topics of what reports might be needed and useful by PIANC members. So if you have ideas for reports that could be useful to a broad audience, whether it's wind-related or any other navigation-related topic, please let us know.
That's good to know. And that goes for all the commissions in PIANC as well. Okay, so upcoming events, Young Professionals webinar and coming up in March. We have a membership meeting. I actually have a date for that. It's the 22nd of April. We decided that this morning. You should be, if you're a PIANC USA member, you should be receiving an email. If not, it'll be on our website. But you can go ahead and pencil it in on your calendar now. 22nd of April, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's a 3-hour session. Should be interesting. Overview from all the different commissions, talking about some things that are going on at the international level, and briefly discuss what we're trying to do in the U.S. section. And then we have an Viacom Working Group 195, another one of the series of webinars that you saw today. It'll be held in May. We have not yet picked the date for that, so stay tuned. It'll come up shortly. Next slide. And here are the contact emails. You can reach the folks as indicated. We look forward to your questions, and we appreciate your participation in this webinar. Many of the activities that PIANC traditionally has held have been were in person, and they're, like most organizations, attempting to hold these virtually, including the annual event, the AGA, which will be virtually in May. But as we move forward and we move out of the COVID, lockdown environment, we're looking forward to a number of activities. One of those is something the PIANC USA section has been helping move forward, is something called PIANC Americas, which is including South America, Central America, and really whether the whole hemisphere, and coordinating the activities, at least from a navigation design and infrastructure development and conversation point of view. So I believe that brings us to a close. I don't see any other questions in the chat box before we wrap it up, other than that was great. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, I got somebody from Argentina. So thank you for your participation, and we look forward to you joining us at the next webinar. Y'all stay safe and enjoy the nice weather outside. It's snowing here, so I don't know what's doing with it. All right, take care.